That's right, we're on the right tab. Yeah. The last one was probably 10, and we're at 10.
Yeah, right, yeah.
Next one will be 5.
And it's great because I need to change battery, you know?
So what time approximately are you wanting to make
I'm going to start trying to make the pizza. You know, I just have to see if the oven's at the right temperature, but I'm going to start shaping them in about 5-10 minutes.
We're going to call the pizza delivery guy in 5
See if
minutes.
it's cool enough.
All right. Okay. We got everybody? Oh, sort of.
But they can actually sit and set too. They don't have to be eaten instantly. They're better if they're not eaten instantly. You know?
Here,
Okay.
let's fix this back since it got
Okay.
What is the best viewing angle, you guys? Right there, it's okay?
Okay. So winter rye is, I call it the workhorse because it's one of the most widely used cover crops, and it has several features that make it a good cover crop. It's competitive against weeds. Its allelopathic suppression of weeds, especially young weed seedlings, is one of the most well-documented examples of allelopathy. It does form a lot of biomass, forms a lot of nice straw for mulch. A lot of people grow rye just to cut it for mulch. They cut it before it forms seeds. It's also really good for retrieving nitrogen. Like, it's the best winter cover crop. Well, it was generally considered the best winter cover crop for picking up nitrogen until the tillage radish came along. And that's now probably one of the best for the east and southern region. But anyway, it's a really good grass to grow as a companion to winter annual legumes because it's taking out all that soil nitrogen, and it's also providing support for a vine legume like vetch. Because it's a workhorse, there is a risk of overusing it. If you plant rye every year, you could either build up a rye disease or you can create subtle biological imbalances in the soil that might make it hard for certain other crops to thrive. So I would just say, maybe you can use it every other year. Anything else? Well, this information on the seeding rate. One thing is the Abruzzi varieties, including Renza Abruzzi. The nice thing about them is they're not quite as cold hardy, but that doesn't matter for us because we don't get that cold. And it doesn't go as dormant. So if you plant late, you want to plant Renza Abruzzi because, or one of the Abruzzis, because it'll continue to grow as the weather cools down, and it'll cover your ground and give you some erosion control. And it'll mature about a month earlier in the spring, which means if you want to go till it mechanically without tillage, like with a mowing or roll down, you can do that earlier. It matures about the same time as crimson clover, whereas the other ryes mature with hairy vetch.
Where do you get it? The Soda Springs carry it?
They don't right now, but Southern Exposure carries it. And I know that William Hale in Central Virginia is growing quite a bit of it as another seed, which is organic seed. So it is getting more available. And also, if you till a tall rye cover crop in that starts to fold up more than yet, it will tie up soil nitrogen unless you have a legume with it.
How long should you wait before you plant it into the
If you till in the cover crop, depending on how much it is and how strawy or stemmy it is, 2 to 4 weeks generally.
What happens with me is you plant it for winter,
Yeah.
late fall.
Yeah.
It comes up, the deer eat it, and it's a golf course, manicured golf course all winter long. And then in the spring, when the deer leave it and go up in the woods and eat again, it starts coming up, and I'll have it, about yay tall before I cut it. And it's with crimson clover.
Right.
But am I losing anything from that?
Well, the deer are reducing the amount of biomass somewhat because they're taking it away, but hopefully they're pooping in there as well.
Yeah,
Getting some nutrients
they're
back.
probably doing that, but then you got gap,
Right, you have the gap concern.
So, yeah, I can't
Do you need
leave
that-
the losing,
you
I
need
got
that
diapers on
20-day
my
gap.
ear, diaper on your ear, yeah.
You need to fence them out then.
Yeah.
That's what you gotta do. So just some other grains that can be grown over winter: winter barley, winter wheat, and triticale. Triticale behaves a lot like rye. It's a rye-wheat cross. Wheat is a little bit harder to kill by mowing and rolling. It's a greater tendency to come back, and it matures later. Winter barley not quite as hardy. I mean, we hardy most last winter had no problem, but it's also more tolerant to drought, a little bit of salt. And it's also been shown to be quite allelopathic, similar to rye.
What about barley? How easy is it to kill?
You know, I don't know for sure whether it's like wheat or more like rye in that respect.
Now, when you say roll kill, if I don't have a roller, can you just bush hog it and then till it in?
You could bush hog it, till it in. Well, another thing you could do with any of these high biomass cover crops, and maybe I'll go ahead and say that right now. I have another slide about it, but the question came up. If you're at a garden or a small, like a market garden scale, small farm scale, consider mowing it off and using the clippings either to make compost or to mulch another bed. Or you can stockpile and then mulch that bed once your crop is established. Then when you just have the stubble, you can do minimum till. You can strip till,
Yeah.
and you can strip till and then windrow your mulch in between, although you could get slug problems that way. You can either use slug go or you might use a different method, but you can also you have a section where you're growing the rye cover crop, and you have a section over here where you have a crop that will be ready to get mulch when this is ready to cut. Then cut it. You got mulch hafer over here. You got it very easy to till on stubble. You still got the root mass down there. You might be able to. You won't really want to no-till because you don't have that mulch there to suppress the little weeds coming out. But you can do much lighter tillage and much less of a weight. You can also think of very strip till, just work up a narrow slot, and then have your mulch cover the rest of the area. Italian ryegrass, sometimes called annual ryegrass, is sort of questionably an annual, sort of between an annual and a biennial. So you really can't kill it by mowing, rolling, and flowering. The strength of it is it has such a tremendous fine fibrous root system that it's a very good erosion fighter. It's a superior erosion control. And it also will really sop up nitrogen about like rye, but it also needs rich soil. The rye can do pretty well on poor soil, whereas this is a little bit like sorghum sedan, really needs the nutrients. Hairy vetch, talked about that one a little bit. That's sort of the workhorse winter annual legumes, hardy to less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Strong nitrogen fixer. If you grow vetch by itself and then till it in, you will get some nitrogen leaching, and you might even overfeed your next crop if it's a thick vetch cover crop. So it's really good to grow it with grass, and having the grain there, having the rye grain or other cereal grain taking up the soil nitrogen will increase the total fixation. It's pretty good at making phosphorus more available. It's pretty good beneficial habitat. And really does best in the winter. If you plant it in the spring, it'll kind of peter out when it gets about this hot. And one thing to watch out for is if you let it set seed, it will become a weed. I wouldn't say that it'll be a terrible destructive weed, but you might need to say, okay, well, I've got vetch again. Maybe I need to be sure to till it down early next time so I knock it out.
Mark, what I hate about it is it seems to set all kinds of hard seed that keeps coming back forever and ever.
Right. I've heard there's a new technique called scarification, where you can buy scarified seed, so when you plant your cover crop, you're not planting any hard seed.
That would be very useful for vetch.
Yeah.
It's terrible that way.
See, I've not had that much problem with it. I have minimal, a little bit, but I haven't had a real big problem.
I've had some fields that just once I put it in, I never got to get rid of it, you know.
Huh. Okay. Okay, I talked about the bicultures and polycultures, the diversity of these points I missed. What we found at Cape Cod when we did rye and veg and the two together is that when we had the two together, we had much more weed suppression and slightly higher biomass and than either one alone. And you get a balanced carbon and nitrogen, like you're feeding the soil a balanced diet. And when the soil gets that balance of carbon and nitrogen, then very often it'll nourish your crop more optimally. You won't get either a burst of nitrogen that's use it or lose it, and then it leaches away in a sandy soil, or overfeeds your crop and you get all foliage, no food. Okay, and another one is that in the case of veg or field peas, having the stiff, straw, tall grain will give it support. And when it's supported, it continues to grow. It doesn't mat down and kind of choke itself out. And this is an experiment on Cape Cod where we actually, this is done manually, cut it down with a sickle, but it could have been rolled or mowed on a farm scale. We planted broccoli afterwards. This is rye and vetch, and no weed control has been done. We let the weeds grow on purpose to see how much weed suppression we would get just from the mulch. There's a few strands of firecrackers, but we have a healthy broccoli crop standing in mulch. And over here we have a woody broccoli crop standing in weeds, and that's with rye alone. And the difference in biomass is not that much. This is 3.5 tons per acre, this is 3 tons per acre. But somehow the combination of the rye and the vetch, and now I think it's just because the vetch being more of a broadleaf and a heavier canopy, shaded out the weeds more effectively than the rye by itself. And the chemical effect or the biological effect in the soil may have been different. So that over here, more weeds were able to thrive. And the other thing is the rye by itself tied up nitrogen, so the broccoli was undernourished and it couldn't get ahead of the weeds. So those weeds that can tolerate the low nitrogen were taking over. Crimson clover, this is a well-liked alternative because it doesn't have as much of a problem becoming a weed, although if you let it set seed, and it will come back. I have seen one squash crop that was pretty much lost when the barley and crimson was rolled too late. And nothing but barley and crimson, these little tiny squash plants. Anyway, but otherwise, it's a good nitrogen fixer. It's not quite as concentrated in nitrogen, so it's not going to give you that leachable, excessive amount of nitrogen all at once, even if you grow it by itself. Beneficial insect habit. It's a moderate weed fighter, not quite as effective as veg and peas. But when you grow it in a vine culture, it can do quite well, but high biomass as well. Solar niche, you're planting with your winter grains. Let's see, it's hardly between 0 and 10 degrees. You know, there are different varieties. Some varieties really won't overwinter up here, but if you buy it locally, you should get, there's one called Chief, and there's one called Dixie, and there's one called Kentucky Select. Those are the ones that I remember as being very hardy. It does, one of the things is because it's stiff-stemmed, it's pretty easy to roll crimp, whereas the veg, you suddenly get a little bit of regrowth and have to mow it off again. Let's see. And it matures about the same time as the Red Zabruzzi bride. Austrian winter field pea, I mean that's that same picture of the peas and the triticale. This, a lot of farmers are liking this particular cover crop more and more because it's just lots of nitrogen fixed. It's a dense canopy. It is a very good companion with the winter legumes. Very easy to manage. It'll mow or crimp really easily. Doesn't become a weed, and you can make several $100 an acre cutting the pea tips selling in the market, and they fetch $7 a pound. And you can cut them a couple times and hardly affect your cover crop output.
Have you had any germination issues with that?
The Austrian peas, so it comes off like magic. And it's very versatile. If you plant it in very early spring, February, March, you get a nice big cover crop in the spring, and unless you have a pretty bad spring drought. And then you can roll it down in June, July, or mow it off. And you can get those pea tips about May. You can plant it in August, and it'll grow a lot in the fall, and when it's tall, it'll winter kill. It'll winter kill at about 20 degrees. You go plant oats and Austrian peas. They said last year. I plant oats and Austrian peas in August, and they go like crazy in the spring. But, usually. But then if you plant peas with a cereal grain in September or October, the pea is only about that tall when it goes into winter. And when it's that small, it's incredibly frosty. I remember one year we had an unprotected freeze at -4 degrees, and I thought, well, so much for the peas. Well, we had peas this tall, impenetrable by the end of May, and there was what it is. You go out there in March, you say, oh well, those look pretty dead. Those a little bit green here, a little bit green there, but they're a little beat up, and then they start growing. And especially when you have the grass with the legume, the fibers reach the grass to prevent frost heat, and that makes a big difference for vegetables. This is an unusual one in the niche because It's a winter annual that self-seeds, and it naturally dies down when it gets hot. There have been some farmers who just plant it once, let it flower, seed, and die, grow a summer vegetable, let it come back up again the next fall. I don't know how many years you do this with one planting, and I don't know if it would become a weed if you want to rotate into a winter vegetable. But it's an interesting variant, and it's more allelopathic than a lot of legumes are. Most legumes, they're so succulent they break down quickly, but apparently it says it definitely weed suppressive effect. Now we're getting into just a few of the perennials. If you've got land that's getting weedy or the soil structure just doesn't seem to be as good anymore, it's kind of tired of intensive cultivation, one of the best things you can do is to plant a pasture grass, locally adapted pasture grass mixed with red and or white clovers. Just let it be for a couple of years. And you'll have that grass legume combination over an extended period. Your annual weed seed banks will decline under that perennial cover because you're not tilling and stimulating the weeds to come up, and you're promoting weed predators. You also have the balance of the carbon and the nitrogen. You just have a steady input. You're feeding the soil continually and not disturbing it this entire period. This is a case, and red clover is really cool because it's very, very shade tolerant. It can sustain itself at 6% of full sun. If you have 12-20% of full sun, like under an open canopy of a vegetable, it'll grow actively. So this farmer, this is up in central Vermont, it's Elliot Coleman, you're right familiar with his books. He had planted tomatoes there, and that's where, I came up in October, and the tomatoes have long since been frost-killed and moved, Charles has been moved. And he planted clover between the tomatoes after they were transplanted and established. And you have an almost complete cover of clover now, so there's no bare soil period. I've heard of farmers planting it underneath winter squash, and when the winter squash forms its dense canopy, it stops growing, but the clover stays there. And then when the squash is finished, the clover covers. Highly recommended for cool to moderately warm climates in the deep south, just too hot, doesn't thrive. Sweet clover is a biennial with a very heavy deep taproot. It grows just about like a tillage radish. You plant it either in spring or August of one year, and you grow it until late spring the following year, let it bolt up. And you can also actually kill that in flower by rolling and mowing. Very strong phosphorus mobilizer, all the legumes particularly. Okay, now we can maybe, I guess Patrick is busy, but does any of you have any specific questions about a particular rotation that you want to help finding what the best crop is for the niche? That's the trick, is to look at your crop rotation and say, okay, what is the best cover crop for to fit into the rotation? Yeah.
Christmas tree farm.
Christmas tree farm. Okay. Now you're talking a perennial cover between Christmas trees. Yeah. Any perennial crop you'll want to probably do a low-growing perennial, or one that you can manage by mowing. I would say a white clover grass combination. Are the Christmas trees a heavy nitrogen feeder? Moderate?
It's actually a wild plantation with 60 to 40% trees. So I'm more thinking how to prevent weeds from coming in if any of the trees fall. Right now there's English ivy as the main ground cover.
Oh, you want a weed suppression for English ivy? I think it's called mold or plow, but then followed by a cover crop. Probably, to get rid of a heavy perennial, what you got to do is really disrupt it with a plow. Don't go too deep. Go about 6 inches so you're not breaking up subsoil. And plow disc and immediately get in there with whatever cover crop in season that's really aggressive. You might start with buckwheat so that you can terminate it after 6 weeks and get another flush of buckwheat. And then maybe go into some of the longer season, just anything high biomass will really have rye and peas in the winter, Sorghum Sudan in the summer. So you're basically learning to reclaim land from native ivy as your Christmas trees germinate. Right? Yeah, well, that's always a trick when you're going into new land. Are you going to eventually go into annual crops here?
No. It'll probably, the Christmas trees will probably be replaced with broadleaves, I'm guessing, in maybe 20 years.
Oh, you're trying to succession it into hardwood.
Yeah.
How much of a slope are you on?
The slope is about 30 degrees.
Okay, you know my words about the plow, forget it. I would say yes, less than like 5% slope. You can plow on the contour to get away with it. That is a question I would take to the NRCS.
Or, do you know Jill Sidebottom?
No.
Jill Sidebottom is an extension specialist, Christmas tree extension specialist,
Alright.
and she's done a bunch of cover crops with Christmas trees, and she's an IPM expert. So Jill _Sidebottom at ncsu.edu.
Do you have hardwoods coming up among them?
Yeah.
I think it's just a matter of protecting and nurturing them. Keep the deer from eating them, keep the ivy off of them. How big an area are you talking?
An acre and a half.
Acre and a half, you can probably manage that. You might have to go in there and just
Yay.
yank and do battle on a manually.
Mark, do you ever do bare fallow for trying to get rid of perennial weeds?
You can do bare fallow. It's very destructive to the soil, of course, and sometimes you have to make a compromise.
Johnson grass, I can make a compromise.
Okay, what has been recommended, what has been found to work with research is you do a vigorous tillage, and you may choose your tool based on what particular weeds you have. Like with rhizomatous weeds where they spread horizontally, if you have a chisel plow or a field cultivator, that kind of yanks them to the surface and dries them out. Whereas if it has something like nutsedge with those little tiny tubers, it's harder. And if you have Canadian thistle with vertical root system, and the horizontal net is very deep, that's very hard to deal with in the same way. But what I would say is you do your initial vigorous tillage, and then you wait until all the bits are going to regenerate. It's inevitable. Let them get 3 or 4 leaves on them. The first 3 or 4 leaves are expending their reserves. After that, they're photosynthesizing and rebuilding. At the 4-leaf stage, 3-leaf stage, get out there and hit it again. And it can be a shallow tillage. You don't have to tear up on earth again. You can go 2 inches deep as long as you're severing all that off. Do that a couple of times, and then maybe just before the last one, go out there and scatter the seeds of a very aggressive cover crop. And you can do research. You can find a cover crop that will suppress that particular weed. For instance, the purple nutsedge or yellow nutsedge as well. The sorghums actually suppress it chemically as well as by direct competition. Anything tall, because it's short and shade intolerant, you can help suppress the nutsedge. So that's what I would do. You do a little bit of bare fallow, but then do cover crop fallow. Cover crop, and then if you see the weeds coming up in the cover crop, hit it again with another cover crop. And otherwise, if you've got a good cover crop and the weeds are pretty much in the shade, let it go to maturity, till it down, put another cover crop in. Another
I
thing you
tended
can.
to do bare fallow when it was dry.
Sorry?
I went to bare fallow when I was in a dry time.
Right.
And then when it got wet again, I sowed cover crop seed.
Exactly. That's a good way to do it.
Because I couldn't work with soil anyway when it was wet, so.
Right.
It was pretty effective.
Well, that's good. But that was what, Johnson grass?
Johnson grass. My farm was originally probably 90% Johnson grass.
Another thing you can do is you can, when you first get a field that's infested like that, as you're working the infestation down, you can first try to produce crops that are not in the season where that weed is growing. Like if you got purple nutsedge, it's a hot weather summer weed. So if you start growing winter brassicas and garlic, you'll be harvesting your crop just as the weed comes in. You'll be planting your crop just as the weed starts to go to sleep. And then you can spend the summer fighting the weed with cover crops.